Good morning. We are called to worship by countless voices, most heard only in the recesses of our hearts, called by a yearning for connection, by a longing for hope and a need for strength. We are called to be nourished by the power of community and the power of our faith. And we are called to find the courage, resilience, and strength to rise to our moment in history. Along our many paths, we are called to this time and place.
We light our chalice with the words of Robin Wall Kimmerer. It is a story about her father speaking to children about a Native American teaching about fire. Did you know, he asks them, that there are 4 kinds of fire? I'm expecting his lesson on hardwoods and softwoods, but there's something else on his mind. Well, first, of course, there's this campfire. Who knows the other kinds of fire? He asks. Forest fires? One of the students tries tentatively. Sure, he says. What the people used to call Thunderbird fires. Forest fires ignited by lightning. Okay, what are the other kinds of fire? My father asks as he adds a stick to the fire at his feet. Another child knows. Sacred fire, like for ceremonies. Of course, my dad says. The fires we use to carry prayers, for healing, for sweat lodges. That fire represents our life, the spiritual teachings that we've had from the very beginning. The sacred fire is the symbol of life and spirit. So we have special firekeepers to care for them. But there's a fire you must tend to every day. The hardest one to take care of is the one right here, he says, tapping his finger against his chest. Your fire, your spirit. We all carry a piece of that sacred fire within us. We have to honor it and care for it. You are the firekeeper. So wrote Robin Wall Kimmerer. And so we light our chalice as a reminder of the sacred fire, and above all, the fire within. We gather here to tend it in ourselves and one another.
And now let us join in the words of our covenant, which will appear on the screen for you. We unite to strengthen the bonds of kinship among all persons, to promote human dignity, and to increase reverence for life's creating, sustaining, and transforming power through worship, study, and service. Mother's Day. It's an almost hair-raising holiday in some ways. My mother is not a sentimental person. She once told me she loathed Mother's Day for the way it marketed motherhood as a sugar-coated fantasy and the right destiny for all women. I'm kind of with her on that. And today, for the first time in 40 years, I sent her a virtual Mother's Day card. I wrote, I know you're no fan of Mother's Day. I dislike the mawkish sentimentality that belies the realities of the impact of motherhood in our culture and on our lives. But I do honor Anna Jarvis and Julia Ward Howe for their work in trying to establish a Mother's Day holiday over many years on account of their longing for peace in the world. And I honor the peace efforts of Jane Addams, which reminds me of you and your own hard work in the peace movement over many years. Thinking of you today, Hillary. And I hit send. That's what I sent. But I have to admit that the mother I feel the most profound attachment to is our ancient mother, the mother who sustains us and in whom we have our being, ancient mother.
Words of Aldo Leopold. The song of the waters is audible to every ear, but there is other music in these hills, by no means audible to all. To hear even a few notes of it, you must first live here for a long time, and you must know the speech of the hills and the river. Then on a still night, when the campfire is low and Pleiades have climbed over rim rocks, sit quietly and listen for a wolf to howl, and think hard of everything you have seen and tried to understand. Then you may hear it, a vast, pulsing harmony, its score inscribed on thousands of hills, its notes the lives and deaths of plants and animals, its rhythm spanning the seconds and the centuries. Our second reading is a poem, Invisible Fish by Joy Harjo. Invisible fish, swim this ghost ocean now described by waves of sand, by water-worn rock. Soon the fish will learn to walk. Then humans will come ashore and paint dreams on the dying stone. Then later, much later, the ocean floor will punctuated by Chevy trucks carrying the dreamers' descendants who are going to the store.
In the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, I remember a wall on which a painted mural moved through a cycle showing an area of Pennsylvania throughout the geologic eras, beginning with the Triassic, just before the arrival of the big dinosaurs. I was a teenager by that time, but I was fascinated watching the movement of evolution, the tiny horses and the changing plant life. And I'd feel this sharp longing as though I missed that landscape and those creatures. I also felt a sense of awe and humility in the face of those millions of years of life and death and change. Of course, it reminded me that there had been wild places everywhere: forests, savannas, mountains, Piedmonts. It also made me uncomfortably aware that beneath the marble floor, beneath the paved street, beneath all the buildings of the city, there was a history, some of it so ancient, in which animals and plants once lived lives that looked so different from my own. Perhaps scholars of culture have a name for this sense of invisible but felt real history. I wonder. It's haunting. When we celebrated Earth Day this year, we visited this sense of people's longing for an Earth less desecrated by human beings. The naturalist Aldo Leopold spent a lifetime in Wisconsin going out to his sand farm, bringing back lost species, plants, animals, out of a love for the community of Earth. He listened to the land, sheltering in place. I'm spending more time than ever indoors, and at the same time, I'm thinking more about the world outside, around, and beneath me. While the world slows, we have a chance to renew our sense of our world for the sake of our world. When I talked about Aldo Leopold on Earth Day, I spoke of his call for a land ethic. And I quoted his words: "All ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, water, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land," end of quote. It's true what he says. However, as I watch so many people like myself yearn for a better sense of community with the land, I've come to realize that my sense, and I think many others' sense, of missing and yearning that community is maybe just a little myopic. We live in an apartment complex with 3 little ponds in the middle of the complex. Geese hang out around the ponds, and a pair nested there for a couple of weeks, and I watch them daily with a sense of deep attachment and fascination. Then last week, walking the dog, I found that some predator had been there in the night, shattered the eggs, and it seemed made a meal of the not yet hatched goslings. I kid you not, I was depressed for at least 24 hours. I was heartsick. My dear husband was patient and understanding of all this. It had been only a couple of years ago when, in his ecological restoration work at Deer Grove, he'd found a very rare indigenous plant, only one. It was a high value plant to a prairie ecosystem, but a week or so later, landscape contractors hired by the Forest Preserve to do some clearing were working in that same part of Deer Grove. On the way to the spot they were supposed to clear, they had crushed that plant. Mark was clearly alarmed and heartbroken. Maybe we're a couple of mush pots. But as they say, better a bleeding heart than none at all. So while every plant and gosling is precious, and I value that, I still have this sense of a myopia. How deep does our connection with the land run? We know we've been pulled away from a sense of connection with the land, though among people here in this congregation and many other people now, there's a movement back into that sense of land community, a longing, a missing for the vibrant life that was, and yet there's something missing from that picture. I think I had a better sense of it when I was a little girl. I've mentioned before I spent part of my childhood in Rochester, New York, and in school we learned about the Iroquois who'd inhabited our area long before I was there. We learned about them, but no one told us where they had gone. I had no idea, and it haunted me. At the Rochester Natural History Museum, I'd seen the dioramas of Iroquois life. Clearly, they were people who lived close to the earth, in harmony with the earth, healthy, happy, loving, vibrant people, very much there. Where on earth had they gone? I saw them nowhere around me. And when my family would go on long drives or visit parks, I would look deep into the woods and wonder if somehow the Iroquois were there, deeply hidden. Clearly, they needed to be in the forest, near water, in places where they could build their long houses, hunt, where they could live peacefully on the land. So when we'd see forests, I'd wonder if the Iroquois were deep in that forest, protected and hidden from my eyes. I wondered if sometime I might see one peek out from between the trees, but of course I never did. I actually thought they needed to avoid the ugly cities of white people which had infested their land, and that was why I didn't see them. I didn't see them. But we know the truth is harder than that. And for every gosling naturally eaten by a predator, there are countless people who belonged in and to the land community who have disappeared or been disappeared in any number of ways.
Cherokee Indian wrote this poem. I hear the beat of the drum. I hear the beat of the drum as the tribes gather on familiar ground. We no longer look as we once were, still trying to hold precious what we know. I hear the beat of the drum. Will we learn to live in this new time? Can we still be the great people we are? I hear the beat of the drum. We will help our children to live here, talking in ways we are not sure. What can we give them that they will want? What is it our children need? I hear the beat of the drum. Can we speak to the little one? Do we remember what to say? I still hear the beat of the drum. I hear the beat of the drum. I hear the beat of the drum and the precious memories of my maternal grandmother who lived with us from the time of my birth. I hear it in her desire to teach me about the ancient ways, smudging our home, treating my illnesses with poultices and potions, all while trying to make sure that I seemed normal and white and acceptable. She lived to be 102, and she never really herself felt like she was truly acceptable. She never knew a time or place where her beliefs were something that just seemed normal. My grandmother was born on the Cherokee Reservation in Oklahoma in 1890. Her father was my great-grandfather and was heartbroken at the death of his wife and the mother of his 8 children. And he loaded his family into a covered wagon and he moved them blindly across the country in the hopes of finding something different, a better way. He didn't like how the Indians were being treated on the reservation, and he didn't want his children being raised that way. They landed in Kentucky, where they found immigrant railroad workers building the railroad through Kentucky, and they set up a migratory restaurant that followed the building of the railroad. And all of the children worked picking cotton in the cotton fields whenever they weren't cooking or serving meals. They adopted the ways of the white men so that they would fit in, but my great-grandfather held strong to his cultural beliefs and his practices and raised his children that way. My grandmother met and fell in love and married one of the immigrant railroad workers, a Swedish man that she loved immensely until the day she died. He passed away before I was born, so I never had the opportunity to know him, but she would speak of him and she would say, he was such a great man. He was so kind, so gentle, but he wasn't a handsome man. He was so pale, eyes like water, always looked ill. He was actually a very handsome, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Swedish man, but she was able to look past his physical flaws and see his warm heart inside. They raised their 2 half-bred children in Garfield Park in the 1920s, a time that we're raising half-breed children or Indians at all was completely unacceptable. And they made perhaps the necessary but sad choice to raise their children as Americans. And they really didn't teach my mom or her brother much at all about the Cherokee culture or about the Swedish culture. My grandmother, who always practiced shamanism through her life, became Christian when she married. And this was a huge lifelong struggle for her because she really did have strong Christian beliefs. But at the same time, she still held strong to her shamanic beliefs of her youth. She definitely believed in the powers of the earth and its offerings. And she taught me that being wasteful or disrespectful to nature was as bad as being disrespectful to a beloved parent. I wouldn't dump garbage in the eye of my mother, so why would I pollute water or why would I litter the land? But this belief, it wasn't explicitly Christian, that the earth was a living creature, that it held power, that it demanded our respect and appreciation. A belief that should be practiced, but it needed to be practiced quietly. I grew up in a devout Christian household. I went to a parochial school. My father was a church deacon, and my mother graduated with a ministerial degree in music from Cincinnati Bible Seminary. On Saturdays, after my piano organ lessons that I took at a local Lutheran church, I would come home and clean house with my family, and then we would smudge our home with sweetgrass and white sage to get rid of any of the negative energies in our home, and also to make it smell good. It also helped me sleep, which was great because I would get up early the next morning to go to church with my father and fill the communion trays. And my mom would always tell me, don't ever, ever talk about those negative energies. If anybody asked why I smell a little different, I was just to tell them that it was just herbs, and they would just assume that we were cooking with them. Because people wouldn't understand about energies, and then people at church would talk about us, and we wouldn't be as well respected. As a young child, for some reason, I also felt that it was more acceptable to tell people that I was an adopted Korean girl than to say I was part Indian. But what was wrong with being Indian? My mom was half Swedish, So she had the same almond-shaped eyes that I did, but she was light in color. She had hazel eyes. She didn't look like me, and nobody ever asked her what she was. My grandma always said that it was easier for us because we were Cherokees, and Cherokees were known as the white Indians, and so that it made it easier for us to fit in. But I really didn't understand why I needed to be different to fit in. I would question why people would play cowboys in India if they were hunting some animals. I really wondered why Peter Pan and his friends were out to hunt the Injuns just because somebody told them to do that. I didn't understand why I would hear people say that Indians were drunks or lazy or scalpers when I didn't think they probably had ever even known if they knew one. I didn't understand why they would say those things to me, like I was somehow supposed to agree with them. Because people don't see the native parts in the people that are around them. It's like hiding in plain sight, being invisible. Hiding the native behind the tree in the forest. They didn't see the quarter Cherokee in me, but they didn't even see the full-blooded white Indian in my grandma. I remember in the early 70s when my grandmother received a quartz watch as a gift from my mother. It was a watch that wasn't wound with a spring. It was a watch powered by the earth. This was like watching my grandma discover that Santa Claus was real, that she could meet him, and that she could touch him. It was the most exciting thing for her, and she endlessly proclaimed this glorious discovery. Do you see this watch? This watch is powered by the earth. There's a quartz crystal running this watch. I've been telling people for years that there are power in the earth, and people didn't really believe me. But what do they have to say about it now? What are they saying now?
What do they have to say now? Mari's grandmother asked. She had on her wrist a symbol of the power of the earth, the power of a quartz crystal, an affirmation that the wisdom of her people was real, true. But no one was going to say, hey, the first people knew what they were talking about. They understood the land and its power. We should respect that. That's what the they, her grandmother, was referring to, probably ought to have said. But they weren't going to and haven't yet. Months ago, at Countryside, the planning team for the annual Journeys Retreat was planning to have the focus of our retreat this year on our relationship with the earth. The timing was great. It coincided with the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day in 1970. The retreat would be at Deer Grove, close to our congregational home, and we could explore the ecological realities and value of our sense of place. To do this, we do lots of different kinds of things together, from discussions to meditation to artwork with natural objects to campfires, walking trails, and even some ecological restoration. Quite a few of us were looking forward to it, and as part of the retreat, the planning team had talked about beginning a conversation about what's called land acknowledgement rituals or processes. I've become familiar with these over many years of attending general assemblies and at the Parliament of the World's Religions, and in some other settings as well. For example, at General Assembly, they'll begin with an acknowledgement of the first people, usually with a representative of a nation or tribe that was close by. An acknowledgement that the land on which we were gathered, which we've designated for the moment that we're together as our holy ground, was once holy ground to the first peoples of this land. In fact, each time we've done this, it's a reminder that the ground we've designated for the moment as our holy ground remains holy ground to the first peoples of this land who are, in fact, still here. I've been inspired by this consciousness and conscientiousness. I've been inspired by the effort made to recognize that when we want to truly connect with the place that we are, we have to remember its history. And I've been inspired by the reality that certainly in our faith tradition now, we recognize the spiritual truths, not only from the wide world's religions, but from the wisdom traditions that grew up in and on the soil of this land. Further, I've been inspired by this growing awareness that our desire to be in solidarity with all who are oppressed includes those whom our society would like to forget or make invisible. So I've been longing for years that we might not only restore some of the prairie ecology around our building, but that eventually we might remember in our building our regional history. Just as we celebrated our congregational history, our anniversary, that we might recognize our longer and older debt to the first peoples of this very ground, that we might, as a congregation, choose to make the invisible visible again. I'm not a believer in ghosts. No, I'm a pretty gritty skeptic, but I also know that things like love, memory, history, joy, suffering leave their mark on the spaces where they've happened. Like the warmth on a chair after a person rises, or the way that my Aunt Joanne feels alive in the cookbooks on the shelf in her kitchen. Or how one can kind of sense the people who once lived in like an old castle or a monastery, or you can almost feel the hand of an artist moving over a sculpture as she once shaped it. Just so, the history of a people lives in and on the land as well as the buildings. It's not just the buildings, their imprint is in the soil. And it lives, just like Allison sang earlier, 'tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. It's the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. So they're not all my ancestors, and they're still here. And we do gather on that holy ground, on their holy ground, ground that surged with the power of quartz crystal, the rebirth of spring, the ability to transform seed into life. And what's more, in the words that Indigenous people often use, we have to remember they're still here. This isn't a ghost story. To acknowledge our debt and the burden of history seems like a central way to inhabit any land with integrity. It goes hand in hand with awakening to the beauty, power, vulnerability of our world. So the team was excited about that, along with the possibilities of hiking and talking and singing and weeding and writing, excited about beginning to explore this aspect of eco-justice, of being more fully awake and alive to our part of the world. Land acknowledgement means acknowledging the land in the fullness of its community. As Leopold said, a vast pulsing score, its rhythms spanning the seconds and centuries. Land acknowledgement will open new possibilities for relationships with people in the present, still struggling to be seen, to keep their land, to be acknowledged as original, not other, but people at the heart of this land. Land acknowledgement will help us lift up the truth that the land was discovered and known more deeply before the Europeans ever arrived. To engage in real land acknowledgement is more than lip service, it's soul service. Of course, these plans were all knocked off kilter as we realized we couldn't meet in person anymore for our worship services, much less for our Journeys retreat. I wanted to offer comfort and support, and it took weeks for me to wrap my head around the fact that we might be forced out of our sacred space by this pandemic. I've been back to the church building a few times since the shelter-in-place order began. I miss our sanctuary, our holy ground, and I look forward to the day that we can return when it is safe for all of us to return. And yet, even my longing to return to our sanctuary reminds me that it stands on ground that was holy long, long before we got there. And it serves to increase my hope that we'll learn even more about our place and her people by becoming more awake and alive, and come to belong more deeply and honorably to our place in the present.
She Came Shining, an honor song for Margot Tamaz. All the things we have swallowed back, everything that has been taken away, hidden and fallen beneath the cracks to silent, wizen, and die. In spaces where we are neither and both, in places where we are borderlands. She came shining, stood beside us, taking our hand, naming our nightmares, speaking them slowly out of power, farther from where we must be, walking between worlds without belonging to either.
I'd like to say a special thank you to Mari Peckham for sharing her stories with us. It is a great gift from within our congregation. I'd like to offer this prayer, to take some time for prayer. Spirit of life and love, ground of being, ground of life. We are blessed and burdened by life, by the joys and sorrows that come to us and occupy our world. In daily life, in our families, in our communities, and even in our bodies. May we be strong, resilient, and creative in our lives. May we be truly present and responsive to one another in our life as a faith community, and in the sure knowledge that we are stronger and better together. And we are blessed and burdened by history. We live not only in our present moment, but bearing history in our bones and blood. We feel the patterns of power and powerlessness. We know even in our whispering bones the joys and sorrows woven into the fabric of time. We are part of that fabric with the wisdom and strength to offer new patterns and heal old rents and tears. In daily life, in our homes, in our cities, in our relationships on our earth. May we be present and responsive to our world. May we hear and see and know with our hearts. May we be strong, resilient, and creative in our lives and in our shared life as a faith community, that we may be sources of healing, for this we know. We are part of the web of life and history, and in our awakening, we can help to restore the part of the web that touches our lives, human, non-human, plant, and system. Amen. This we know. We are part of a web of life and blessed to be present to one another, even when the threads seemed stretched thin and we are apart physically. We are part of an interdependent community of faith. We are part of a world woven together still. We are blessed to have this time together. We are blessed indeed. And I'd like to take a moment to extinguish the light of our chalice. And those of you who have chalices at home may be extinguishing the light of them at the same time. And to recognize that the real light is here, burning bright in every one of you and in all living things. May you go forth from this gathering knowing that in your heart and in your bones, you are welcome on this earth. Your light belongs here. Let's take a moment to connect with one another by pointing our hands, palms outward toward the edges of our screen so that we can safely hold hands for this time. And you can repeat after me these words. I join my hands with yours so that we might accomplish together that which we cannot accomplish alone. Go forth in a spirit of love and peace, and return ever to our gatherings with your hearts open and your hands ready to do the work of rebuilding the beloved community, which is the work of healing our world. As we listen to our postlude, don't go away, because afterwards there'll be information about how you can go into our coffee hour. Again, special thanks to Mari Peckham for her work in this service, and to all of you for being here on this Mother's Day.